Thank you to Harald and Phil and Greg for inviting me. It's a pleasure, as always, to be here with everyone. And it is now my great honor to introduce Dr. Kelli Rudolph, who's a leading international expert in the history of philosophy. She's currently senior lecturer in classics and philosophy at the University of Kent. She has previously held a postdoctoral research fellowship in the Faculty of Philosophy at the University of Oxford. And Dr. Rudolph is a fellow of the Harvard Center for Hellenic Studies in Washington, D.C. in 2024 and 25. In 2025 and 26, she'll be taking up a Leverhulme research grant, which is incredible. I cannot wait to see how this goes. And this project is especially relevant for us at Modern Stoicism because she's asking, what is popular Stoicism doing to the philosophy? So she'll be examining why Stoicism as a moral framework is so enormously popular today, and how it can also become distorted when people selectively isolate and amplify certain features. So really looking forward to that. Dr. Rudolph's past work has focused on fragmentary sources in ancient physics and epistemology, the importance of ancient arguments for contemporary debates, and developing the field of sensory studies in the classics, which I find especially interesting, especially her edited volume, Taste and the Ancient Senses. And of course, she's the lead author for the paper Academic Freedom as a Public Good and is a highly regarded advocate for academic freedom. So Dr. Kelli Rudolph, welcome and thank you so much for being with us today.
Great, thank you so much for that fulsome introduction, Brittany. I appreciate it. So I'm gonna share, maybe I'll share a screen. Yeah, here we go. So I've got some slides for us to look at today while I'm talking. And that should now work. Yeah, everyone I hope can see that. Great, so thank you, Brittany, again for the introduction, and Greg and Harold and Phil. Thank you so much to everyone else here for attending today. It's really a privilege to speak to such a wide audience. So today, I'm going to be talking about motivating Stoic cosmopolitanism. And what I'm going to be talking about is Stoic cosmopolitanism in particular. And then the motivation problem I'm interested in is one that is a general problem with cosmopolitanism, not just the Stoic variety. And that is this problem. The general problem is that there's a gap between our commitment to the cosmopolitan principles and our taking significant action to bring them about, right? So this isn't motivating a person to believe in cosmopolitan principles, but this is about how we motivate action. How do we get people to act on those principles once they hold them? That's the kind of interest that I have today. And that's because there are lots of different kinds of cosmopolitanisms out there these days, and it's a general problem that people who are working on cosmopolitanism face. But there's a particular problem in relation to the Stoics that is set out by Martha Nussbaum, and that is directed specifically at the Stoics and at Stoic cosmopolitanism. So that is the problem I'm going to deal with today. And it will also hit the kind of general motivational problem we see here. So Martha sets out the problem in her 2019 book on the Stoic cosmopolitan tradition and why it's a flawed ideal. So she says this: Stoic moral theory permits us to salve our conscience about our failure to aid our distant fellows, telling ourselves that no serious harm has befallen them. The Stoic position seems to be either these things like miserable conditions, poverty, malnourishment, etc., are external blows, in which case they don't touch what really matters, or they are the result of some moral weakness in the person, in which case they do matter, but the person themselves is to blame. This is the Stoics' false dichotomy, she writes. Oops, let's move back. Either it's unimportant or in the control of the will. Thus, as we know too well, poverty is often treated as a moral failing, even by people who would not so treat the damages done to a person by rape or torture or even racial discrimination. In the areas of the duties of material aid, she concludes, Stoicism lives on. So today what I want to focus on is this claim that there's a false dichotomy in Stoicism, that either indifference or external things are unimportant, or they're in control of the will. But in either way, they are where the problem lies. So in order to address this problem, we need to just be reminded of some basic tenets of Stoic ethics, some of the basic commitments of the Stoics. So these I present in very brief form. I'm assuming I was thinking about philosophy and the Stoics. Some of us are brand new to it, so I want to just set out the kind of basics that we need to understand to get this argument going. So the first is that virtue is the only good, that vice is the only evil, and that everything else is indifferent. That the good human life, that the fulfilling life, that our happiness consists in living virtuously, and that indifference are unnecessary. This is Martha Nussbaum's definition of it, right? This is the way she spells it out. The indifference are unnecessary for the good human life. And from that claim, she finds that the Stoics ground an argument about human equality and common dignity. So something that we want for cosmopolitanism, and that it also grounds Stoic emotional detachment from people and things, and it also grounds a kind impartiality towards people and things. But it's that third point that I'm going to take issue with today, that indifference are unnecessary for human flourishing or the good human life. Because I think we would need to ask, well, what do we mean by unnecessary, right? The good philosophical person in the room is asking, well, what do we mean by this word? And I'm going to pick on this particular point because it's the point from which she draws her conclusions. So her view of Stoicism is this, right? That everything is equally devoid of value on their view, that when we have a detached way of viewing the world around us, we can't motivate any kind of effort for benevolence, and it turns the world into a place that isn't worth living in, that we are forced to remake humanity, right? That the Stoic sage isn't fully human in some way, that they transcend their humanity, is the basis of her claim. And that once we create this world, what we find is that it's actually kind of barren and frightening in her terms. But she thinks that nevertheless, we need to take the challenge that they set seriously. So for her, she says, the problem is, how can there be any kind of benefiting? How can benevolence take place against this background of a view that has leached all importance out of the things in life which people usually like to be benefited by, right? So what she says in short are the point and the purpose of the moral and political life. Now we can see how Nussbaum arrives at this view, given the evidence that she presents in her text. Given those basic tenets of Stoicism, we can see where she comes to this. She gets this point of view. And we're going to look at some of that evidence that she presents at the end, which she takes from Marcus Aurelius. But what we find is that there are some pieces of the puzzle that are missing in her depiction of the Stoic view. And these pieces of the puzzle that are missing are pieces that we find in Cicero and in Epictetus. And once we see them, what we'll actually find is that the passages she cites from Marcus Aurelius begin to make sense if they're viewed in the light of the bigger picture of Stoicism. So we're going to turn now to one of the first pieces of missed evidence that comes from Cicero and relates to the nature of virtue. So in the De Republica, Cicero says that truly it is not enough to have virtue, as if it were some sort of skill, unless you use it. So he thinks that virtue depends wholly upon its use, and that its greatest use is in the governance of the city and the completion in fact, not in speech, of the same things as these men, that is, the philosophers, shout about on the corners. All right, so what Cicero is saying here is that there is a moral imperative that we have to put virtue to use, and that use is best worked out in the governance of the city, but that what we are aiming for here is an actual completion of duties, not in words, but in deeds. So he's drawing a strong connection between virtue and action and the use of something. But then we have to ask, well, what is it that we're supposed to be using? What does that look like, virtue and use? And that becomes clear in our second piece of evidence from Epictetus. So Epictetus in Discourses 2.5 spends a lot of time talking about the indifference and the way indifference relates to virtue. And I would love to spend time going through all of the bits and pieces of this, but I'm going to give you the highlight version today. And hopefully, as Greg said, we can continue the conversation. But he says this: materials are not indifferent, or are indifferent. Sorry, materials are indifferent, but the use that one makes of them is not indifferent. And his interlocutor asks, well, then are we to use externals carelessly? And Epictetus replies, not at all, for this is bad for the faculty of the will. It's bad for our prohairesis, our capacity of choice. And thus it's contrary to nature. But we should act carefully because the use is not indifferent. And we should also act with firmness and a calm mind because the material is indifferent. But the use I make of them is either bad or good, and the use is in my power. So that line draws a really clear link between virtue, right, which is where good and bad reside, and the use of it is in our power, right? It is in the power of our will. And he says that you have to understand that piece alongside the fact that these materials are indifferent, and that knowledge is what gives us firmness and calmness of mind. And he says it's difficult, to be sure, to unite and combine these two states of mind. And he says we should do our best to apply our skill to any external material, not as valuing the material, but whatever it may be, showing our skill in it. When then you have received the material, he says, work on it. And he gives two analogies to help us understand this. And I think they do really help clarify what's at stake. So he gives us two examples, one of ball games and one of the body. So in his analogy of the ball game, I think things become very clear, because he says, right, that if you think about expert basketball players, right, and you think about, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I have twin 6-year-olds. Okay, I have a boy and a girl. And when you look at them playing basketball, they don't play like experienced basketball players, right? My 6-year-olds think that having the ball is the important thing. So a couple of weeks ago, when I took them to the basketball courts, they just held the ball because that's what was valuable. That's what's important to them, just holding the ball. But an expert knows, right, that it's not the ball itself that is of value, right? But rather what is good or bad about the ball is the use you make of it, how you throw it and how you catch it. It's the exact opposite of holding the ball that's important, right? So the player's agility and their skill and their speed and their good judgment are demonstrated in the use they make of the ball. And Epictetus says this is how we should act too, with the close attention of the cleverest ball players who show the same indifference to what we are playing with as being no more than a ball, right? Because the ball itself can be any color, it can be sometimes any size, right? And a good basketball player will be able to play with it. So he says that's what's important, is the use we make of it, not the ball itself, but the skill we bring to it. And as I tell my 6-year-olds all the time, right, if you're going to be a really good basketball player, you have to practice. And that's exactly what Epictetus is saying, right? It's not easy, but we have to practice at using the ball. And the more we practice, the better we'll get at it. And in the same way, the more we practice working with indifference, the better we're going to get at them, at the use of them in alignment with virtue. Right. And so with this analogy, right, Epictetus acknowledges that this isn't easy. And Nussbaum might reply that, all right, well, you may have found a way to motivate the careful treatment or the careful use of externals, But we still haven't managed to motivate their use at the level of the cosmos. In fact, we haven't even been able to motivate them at the level of anything but, say, personal use, or maybe even those nearest to us. And that's where Epictetus's second analogy comes in, where he says, he answers the question about these externals, because his interlocutor says, all right, well then, so you say some externals are in accordance with nature and others are contrary to it. Some in other places say that Epictetus says, well, if you ask the question in isolation, then you're right? So he gives an analogy of the body, and he says, and if you have a foot in isolation, that foot should by nature be clean. But if you consider it as a foot, as part of the body and not in isolation, it'll be appropriate for it to step in mud and to trample on thorns, and sometimes even to be cut off for the sake of the body as a whole. Because if it's not seen in that whole view, then it is no longer a foot. And he says we should think about ourselves in the same ways. So if you consider yourself in isolation from other people, then it's natural for you to live to be old and to be rich and to be healthy. But if you consider yourself as a human being and a part of the whole, then that's not always going to be the case. Sometimes you're going to suffer. Right? And he said, don't you know that in isolation, you will no longer be a human being? Because a human being is part of the city. First, the cosmos, right? The cosmic city, that made up of gods and humans. And then the one that we call the city, which is closest to us in a microcosm, right? So Martha Nussbaum might then say, well, look, here's your evidence, right? This is exactly the kind of statement that she would say points us towards a detached view, right? That some people are just destined to be sick and in poverty, and that's not my problem. That's, their role in the universe, so they need to just live with it. But we have to remember that this analogy is being presented to us within the context of how we use indifference. And it's that Epictetus doesn't want us to lose sight of. So this isn't about others, but about ourselves, right? And it's about getting our own use of indifference in right relation to our understanding of how we sit in relation to the cosmos as a whole, and how we even sit in relation to those who are closest to us. And it comes to this final point for him, which is that it is your role, he says, to step forward and say what you ought and to deal with these things as they turn out. So here he's directing us towards thinking about not just the function and use of the things, right, the externals, but also to think about our proper function as human beings, but also in our particular roles. And it's that focus here on roles that I think gives us the second piece of the second sort of missing puzzle piece for answering this problem. I think this also, by the way, gives us a very clear steer on social activism and maybe even nonviolent resistance from a Stoic perspective, but that's another talk. So let's focus on the roles. So these get spelled out most nicely in Cicero's On Duties, where he says that there are 4 natural roles that we have, and the Latin word that he uses is persona, which is the word for mask in Latin. So he says that there are 4 natural personae for human beings. The first is that we have a universal nature. The second is that we have an individual personality, characteristics that are particular to us. That we also have a personal identity that is circumstantial, right? The roles that we inhabit as a member of a family, or as a member of a certain class or nationality or gender, or some of the public offices that we are asked to take up. And that we also have chosen specializations, whether we're philosophers or lawyers or whatever. But above all, he says, we must decide who and what sort of people we want to be and what kind of life we want to lead. And this is the most difficult question of all, because this, again, is where the rubber hits the road. It's where the use of externals comes into question. So, again, what we find is that the relation of virtues to indifference, right, brings us to this position, right, of asking what our role is, and what within the position I am in I can do with the things at my disposal, And it's that link that I think gets us over the motivational hump that has been identified. So I think that, so Martha Nussbaum says that we are left with a moral capacity on her interpretation, but nothing for which these capacities actually matter. She says it's the tendency to justice, but no urgent work for justice to accomplish. And I think once we see those two missing pieces of virtue in practice, right, being used on externals, and us living out the roles that we are in, and making use of indifference in alignment with virtue within those roles, that we can negate this claim, right? Because we're not just a moral capacity, right? Our will with nothing to work on, but actually there are lots of matter. There's lots of matter out there for us to work on. All of the externals, all of the indifference are things for us to work on, whether they're preferred or dispreferred. So we don't just have a tendency to justice, but we also, right, if we are aiming to live virtuously, then the only way we can accomplish that is by using the indifference or the external objects that are at our disposal within the context of the roles that we inhabit. So I think that the Stoics answer that challenge. But she also raises this one, that it is the essence of Stoic cosmopolitanism that things should be seen this way, denuded of their original human significances, since these significances are erroneous. He, speaking of Marcus Aurelius, strips the human. What we find here is that it's the opposite, that when we begin to focus on virtue as the use of indifference, and we see the role of indifference as the material for virtue, for the promotion and exercise of virtue, that we actually re-embed the human in the external things, because then we begin to understand how we use those to live out the flourishing human life, right? By acting in alignment with virtue on external objects. So let's look at a couple of those passages from Marcus Aurelius, and then we'll open it up to debate and some discussion. So one of the passages she picks up on is this passage from Meditation. You're going to meet people. You need to say to yourself in the morning, I'm going to meet people who really irritate me, who are horrible, but I have to know that the nature of the wrongdoer is of one kin with mine, and that I can't feel angry at them, and that I need to, right, remember that we are born to labor together. And he also uses this body analogy, like the feet, the hands, the eyes, right? To work against one another is therefore, he claims, contrary to nature. And to be angry against a man or to turn one's back on him is to work against him. And I think this is really important. It echoes the passage of Cicero in the De Officiis, where he says that the injustice of not acting is as harmful, is as bad and morally wrong as active injustice, right? Actually doing harm actively to others. And I think that's mirrored here. But Nussbaum sees here, is silent about the act of labor that is focused on here. And she seems to think here that the most important thing is that he's trying to remove his anger, and he can only do that if he understands that he's part of a larger whole. But I think that when we think about that laboring together, and the way that we have to consider both our action and our passivity in relation to the whole, gets us closer to understanding how we use those indifference. She also points to this passage from 520, where Marcus says that human beings, we can see them in two different ways. We can see them as the closest things to us in the world, that we should stick to them through difficulty, and that we should do good to them. But we also have to see them as obstacles to the acts that most concern us. And she sees here that, she says that this is a sign of flipping very quickly from concern for other human beings to a cool detachment, and that quick flip shows that it's not real connection, not real closeness to other human beings. But I think that's to misread the passage. I think he's not saying that we flip from one to the other in a moment, but that human beings will sometimes present themselves as obstacles to us acting virtuously, and we have to be able to, right, as a good ball player, as an expert, we have to build an expertise in understanding how we need to use the externals in front of us in any given moment, how we need to think through our relationships with people around us. And I think he's just presenting those two options here. I don't think there's that flipping idea that she thinks is here. She also cites this passage from Meditations 11:18, where Marcus says that kindliness is immovable. And if it's genuine, that's even more the case. And he says, for what can the most violent person do to you if you persist in being kindly to him? And if you have a chance, gently exhort him and teach him a better way at the very time when he's trying to damage you. Now, she thinks that this is a problem because it's condescending and it's dismissive of the things that matter. And the person who matters. And I don't think that's what's going on here, actually. What we have here is a position of a person in weakness to a position of a person in strength, right, who is being violent. And perhaps here what we are seeing is actually a call to action, to speak truth to power, and to resist those in a gentle and kind way, understanding that they too are human, right? But addressing the problems, not pushing too hard, not treating them as a means rather than an end, to use Kantian terms, but to nonetheless call them on the truth. And finally, she turns to this passage, which I think is a really important one, which is from Meditations 5:36, where Marcus says, if there is a shortage of things indifferent, do not imagine that there is any great evil present, for that is a bad habit. But still, as the old man in the play gave his child back the little top, fully mindful that it was just a top, you too have to behave in a similar way. And again, Nussbaum's analysis of this passage is that what we have here is a kind of paternalistic condescension that is fundamentally dismissive of indifference. It is fundamentally dismissive of the things that matter most to the child, right? The top really matters to the baby, but the father thinks and knows it is just a top. I think that is true, right? That Marcus is trying to get here at that balance that Epictetus was talking about between understanding how best to use indifference and understanding that they have no value in and of themselves, but only in their use. But I think that actually what he's doing here is something even more important. And it's because of that if clause right at the beginning. If there is a shortage of things indifferent, if you are working in times of scarcity, when everything becomes precious, Marcus is reminding us that even in those moments, we have to remember the indifferent status of material things. But we have to act on the basis of our understanding of how best to use those externals. And that is to make sure that we give to those who are most in need of the objects in front of us, the things that they need, to give to those who can make best use of the materials, the things that are at our disposal, right? The old man has no need of the top. It's useless to him, but in a time of scarcity, you might hold it just because you think having something is better than having nothing. Right. But I think what Marcus is saying here is that we shouldn't grasp things that we can't make use of. That old man can make no use of the top, but the child can. So I think there's something more going on here than just a kind of dismissiveness of materials as playthings, and a condescending attitude towards those who want them. So to get to the kind of general point then, right? The question that Martha asked that started this paper was, what in short are the point and purpose of the moral and political life? And I think we can generalize what we've seen into three main points. The first is that we need to persist, and I emphasize persist. We need to persist in action or abstain from action in our use of externals in such a way that we express and promote virtue. that we have to understand that our local involvement should reflect the recognition that although different kinds of people have different claims on us, human beings have solidarity with each other, and that all things being equal, we should get involved in social and political life as befits our personality, our identities, and our chosen specializations. So I think all of this is the thing that underpins cosmopolitan action. It's what gets us over that motivational gap that has been identified for Stoicism. I think these principles also, as I said before, have a bearing on Stoic activism. But again, that's a separate talk. So thank you all very much for listening, and I look forward to some questions from you all. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that folks can see each other. Right.
Thank you very much, Kelly. That was amazing. You brought in so many good ideas. I know there's going to be a great discussion. I do already see some questions in the chat. So I'd like to remind everyone, if you do have a question or maybe a comment or something that you'd just like Kelly to elaborate on, if you could put it in the chat and I'll try to grab it out for you. So one thing that caught my attention was Scott Bennett says, just because I can use my skill set to endure difficult situations doesn't make it right to turn away from others who are suffering, expecting that they should have the same skills. Anyone who's ever looked after a child knows this. I can go an afternoon without eating, no problem, but I would be a terrible parent to expect a 3-year-old to do the same. So I wondered if, given that you have your 6-year-old twins, if you have any other comments about this.
Yeah. So I think you're right. We're I think the Stoics have an idea. Their notion of cosmopolitanism is a transitional one, right? I think that's the kind of reality of the Stoic position, is that we all want to be a sage, but we're all transitioning towards sagehood, right? Is the claim, right? And the idea is that this takes work. And you can't expect people at an early stage of development, if they're young, or at an early stage of their studies, if they are on their way to becoming a Stoic, to fully live out the detail. But yeah, I think, I often draw on Stoic insight as a parent, I have to say. If nothing else than to remind myself that I need to. I was saying this to Phil, actually, when we were doing the tech thing. I find that I sometimes have to hold myself back and let my children have the experiences they need to have, right? I think that's the other thing, is that we can't always instruct. We sometimes have to hold ourselves back and allow the opportunities to arise for our children to learn from experience and to figure it out for themselves, sometimes by getting it wrong.
Exactly. And I think that leads into a question that I had for you. Does Nussbaum mention this idea of oikeiosis at all, which is often associated with Stoic Cosmopolitanism, or has that come up in your work? I know a lot of people are probably wondering what the relationship is between these ideas and the concept known as oikeiosis, which is translated as appropriation or familiarization, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think it does. So in the longer version of this talk, I had a slide on oikeiosis, but I wanted to make sure that there was enough time for conversation, so I took it out. So yeah, absolutely. I think oikeiosis plays a big role here, right? Because that's the idea that we are self-preserving by nature, and that we belong to ourselves. But actually, another side of our nature is that we are social beings, that we are other regarding, and that our love for others is fundamental to what we are as human beings, and that combination, right, plays out. You kind of see that is the kind of basis for the tension that we see in those passages in Epictetus and in Marcus Aurelius, where they're saying, like, this is, it's really hard because I really care about people, but they also really irritate me. And how do we balance that? Well, that's what we're working on, right? That's what. And oikeiosis plays with that tension, and it grounds that tension in that notion of what is ours and what belongs to us. And I think that, it gets spelt out really nicely in that fragment from Hierocles, where we get, I'm sure everyone is familiar with that sense of the kind of rings of connection between people, right? That if I'm at the center and my family's the next circle out, and then my community, and so on and so forth, until we get to the cosmos. And I think what's so powerful about that, and what is so often missed about that image, is that Heracles says that our aim is to pull the outer circles inwards, right? It's not about becoming more impartial towards those close to us, but it's about bringing other people closer to our circles of concern. And I think that orientation is really key to understanding the notion of oikeiosis and understanding how we work out the use of indifference. Is that we aim to bring people closer, not to care less about the people near us.
Absolutely. I completely agree. Thank you for that. And that kind of ties into a question from JP Quirk. How large does your cosmos have to be in order to be virtuous? In other words, am I required to expand my efforts to the greatest extent possible, or can my cosmos be on a smaller scale yet remain virtuous?
Oh, good question. So I think the Stoics would say, nope, you've got to go all the way, right? To the furthest Myesian, right? That's our aim. It's hard to get there. So we want to start, we start to, as you say, it's connected to that idea of oikeiosis, right? We start with concern for ourselves, and then we have concern for those nearest to us, and then we step out another step. But the idea is that we have to get out to the cosmos. We have to get to the people who are furthest from us. We have to understand that we are equal and of equal worth and dignity across all people everywhere, not just those who are close to us. So I don't think that the Stoics have a kind of, let's say, liberal nationalist perspective. I think they're trying to get us to move beyond that, to move beyond communitarianism and that liberal nationalism towards a much broader understanding of what it is to be human and what the spheres are in which we need to act.
I liked how you put it in your slide. I think you said solidarity of humankind or something along those lines. I think that's a great way of putting it. And one question that I've personally had is how to reconcile, our inability to help people on the other side of the world all too often with our obligation to care about them as equal humans. This is something that I personally, I've spent a lot of time thinking about and kind of struggling with. So I just wondered if you have a perspective on that as well.
Yeah, so I think it's about I think we have to think really hard about our roles, right? So I think this is where that idea of the roles that we inhabit becomes really important, because there are spheres within which we can work, right? And there are spheres within which we can't, right? I cannot call Joe Biden and talk to him about world politics. I just can't. I don't have those connections, right? But within my sphere of influence, I can do a lot. I can talk to people, I can talk to my local community, or I can do what my 6-year-old son did, right? And have a lemonade stand in England, of all places, where there is not a tradition of lemonade stands, right? And he raised money for UNICEF for children who are suffering all over the world, right? And he did that because he had seen what was happening in the news. He was really concerned about other kids and said, I want to do something about it. And, all he could do was run a lemonade stand, but he ran a lemonade stand, right? And then we sent the money to UNICEF. And I think that, it's about finding that what within the realm I am in, within the world I am limited by, right? What can I nonetheless do? Because I think there is always something we can do, right? I think there is always some kind of action we can take. And if enough of us take that action, right, then change can happen. And I think you see this in all sorts of ways, right? I think unions are a really good example of this, right? Where you get small local actions that actually have a big impact nationally or internationally, right? Protests are another good example.
Yes, and I think I saw in the chat some people are very interested in hearing more from you on that strand, but we will have to save that for another talk, everyone. So
yeah, next year.
Just one quick question. We only have 2 minutes left, but someone says, how do you bring the outer circles closer? Or how do you react to people who resist your efforts to bring them closer? When people are not really on the same page as you, how do you interact with those people?
Yeah, so that's a great question, because this is the case that Marcus is talking about when someone becomes an obstacle to virtue for you, And then I think you have to understand their humanity. You have to see them as human beings and treat them as human beings. But you also have to do what Epictetus said, right? Which is that you step forward and you say what you have to say. You say what you ought to say. And then you deal with the consequences, right? But I think that what you never do is compromise the virtue. You never compromise your commitment to the principles of cosmopolitanism, even in the face of resistance. Right? And I think that becomes really, really hard. I think, in our everyday lives, right? That's not so, in Western society, that's not so hard. In places like the Ukraine or Gaza or Sri Lanka or the Sudan, it's a matter of life and death. It becomes much, much harder. But I think, nonetheless, right, we have a duty to hold firm to those principles, that's what we're after, right?
All right. Yes, thank you so much. I am sure everyone will join me in applauding. If you want to just press your applause button, everyone. Kelli Rudolph, thank you so much. This was a wonderful
Thanks
talk,
very
and we
much.
hope to see you back soon.
Oh, great. Thanks very much. A real pleasure.
Harald, over.